June 6, 1944. Dawn breaks inside Widerstandsnest 62, a concrete bunker overlooking Omaha Beach. 20-year-old German machine gunner Heinrich Severloh stares through a narrow firing slit at an armada that defies imagination. From the German perspective, high on the bluffs, the American assault looks like absolute tactical suicide. Infantrymen are wading through open water directly into pre-sighted interlocking fields of fire. By 7:30, the invasion is effectively paralyzed. Pinned down and taking heavy losses, the American advance stalls. Behind their concrete walls, the German defenders look down at the crippled landing force and believe they have already won the battle. Yet, within just a few hours, that illusion of absolute victory completely shatters. The seemingly impenetrable Atlantic Wall crumbles, and the German defenders who believed they had broken the invasion are soon either dead, captured, or retreating in disarray.
To understand how the momentum shifted so violently, we have to strip away decades of post-war mythology. We must look past heavily disputed memoirs and the inflated kill counts later claimed by individual defenders like Severloh, focusing strictly on the documented mechanics of the breakthrough. The reality of Omaha Beach was not a simple matter of overwhelming industrial might washing over outgunned defenses. The early morning for the Americans was defined by systemic catastrophe. Dozens of specialized amphibious tanks sank to the bottom of the English Channel, leaving the first waves of infantry without critical armor support. Strong currents pushed landing craft hundreds of yards away from their designated sectors, completely dismantling unit cohesion before boots even touched the sand. Officers were wiped out, radios were lost in the surf, and the massive pre-dawn bombardment had largely missed the concrete bunkers. This presents the central historical mystery of the sector. How exactly did an assault force, suffering devastating early casualties, stripped of its heavy weapons, and pinned against a rising tide in the wrong drop zones, manage to claw its way off the sand and crack open one of the most formidable defensive networks ever constructed? The answer lies not in flawless planning, but in improvised initiative, lethal point-blank naval intervention, and critical blind spots within the German command itself. To comprehend the scale of this impending collision, one must first look at the ground itself.
Omaha Beach is not merely a stretch of sand.
It is a natural amphitheater, meticulously engineered into a kill zone. The topography heavily dictates the tactical reality. The beach forms a gentle crescent, stretching for roughly 4 miles. At low tide, the water retreats hundreds of yards, exposing a wide, flat expanse of wet sand that any attacking force must cross entirely without cover. At the high water mark lies a bank of loose shingle stones, and just beyond that, an impassable seawall. Looming over the entire expanse are steep bluffs, rising as high as 170 feet. For an invading army, getting onto the beach is only the first problem. Getting off it is the true operational nightmare. There are only 5 usable ravines, referred to by the Americans as draws, that cut through the bluffs and provide a paved or dirt exit inland. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the architect of the Atlantic Wall's final upgrades, recognized this geographical bottleneck perfectly. He knew that Germany, lacking air superiority, could not afford to fight a mobile, mechanized war deep inside France. The invasion had to be crushed at the water's edge within the first 24 hours. To achieve this, the German engineers did not string a continuous, linear trench line across the sand. Instead, they concentrated their combat power into an interconnected network of independent strongpoints known as Widerstandsnests, or resistance nests. Widerstandsnest 62, where Heinrich Severloh is stationed, is the largest and most lethal of these complexes at Omaha. Positioned to dominate the Colville Draw, WN62 is a subterranean fortress of reinforced concrete casemates, deep communication trenches, Tobruk pits, and observation posts. Crucially, the main artillery pieces and heavy machine guns within these strong points are not pointed straight out toward the English Channel, where they could be easily spotted and destroyed by the guns of the Allied fleet. Instead, the concrete embrasures are angled sideways, designed to fire parallel to the beach. This creates a devastating enfilade. When the Americans land, they will not be walking into frontal fire. They will be walking into intersecting cones of flanking fire, sweeping the sand like a scythe. To ensure the attacking infantry remain trapped in these kill zones, Rommel has ordered the surf filled with millions of obstacles, timber ramps armed with teller mines, steel Czech hedgehogs, and Belgian gates, all designed to tear the bottoms out of landing craft at high tide and provide zero cover for infantry at low tide. The lethal engineering of the beach, however, is only half of the equation. The other half is the human element manning the weapons. And it is here that Allied intelligence has made a critical miscalculation. The American assault plan, specifically for the U.S. 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions, is calibrated against a very specific assumption regarding the enemy. For months, Allied intelligence, relying on French resistance reports and aerial reconnaissance, identified the 716th Static Infantry Division holding the Omaha sector. The 716th is a second-rate garrison force composed largely of older men, soldiers downgraded for medical reasons, and conscripts drafted from occupied Soviet territories. Based on this intelligence, the American timetable allows for a relatively rapid suppression of the defenses and a swift push inland. But the intelligence picture is fatally outdated. Since March 1944, a completely different force has quietly moved into the coastal zone, the 352nd Infantry Division. While not an elite armored unit, the 352nd is a vastly superior fighting force compared to the expected garrison troops. It features a hardened core of combat veterans who have survived the brutal, unforgiving meat grinder of the Eastern Front, supplemented by younger, fitter German conscripts. Under the command of General Lieutenant Dietrich Kreis, these troops have spent the spring rehearsing counterattacks, familiarizing themselves with the terrain, and meticulously zeroing their artillery and machine guns onto specific sectors of the beach. When the first American landing craft drop their ramps, they will not be facing demoralized second-tier troops ready to surrender after a naval bombardment. They will be walking into the crosshairs of disciplined infantrymen manning highly fortified positions. To crack this formidable defensive network, the American blueprint relies on an intricate, highly synchronized mechanical ballet. The invasion planners have no intention of throwing unsupported infantry into a frontal assault against concrete pillboxes. The American strategy is designed to rely on overwhelming technology and firepower. The infantry are supposed to be the mop-up crew, advancing only after the defenses have been systematically dismantled. The plan hinges on 3 successive hammer blows leading up to H-hour at 6:30. First, a massive pre-dawn bombing raid by hundreds of heavy bombers is scheduled to pulverize the coastal defenses. Second, a relentless, point-blank naval bombardment from battleships, cruisers, and destroyers is intended to shatter the concrete casemates and detonate the millions of mines in the surf. Third, and perhaps most critically, the American plan relies on a specialized, armored vanguard. The infantry are scheduled to land exactly 1 minute after modified Sherman tanks, known as duplex drive or DD tanks. Fitted with large canvas flotation screens and twin propellers, these 32-ton machines are designed to be launched from landing craft miles offshore, swim through the waves, drop their screens as they hit the sand, and instantly provide the vulnerable infantry with mobile artillery support to suppress whatever is left of the German Widerstandsnests. The stage is set for a monumental collision of 2 rigid, highly engineered strategies. The American operational blueprint assumes the German defenses will be neutralized by explosives and armor before the infantry ever touches the sand. The German tactical blueprint assumes the Americans will be pinned down in the crossfire just long enough for armored reserves to arrive and annihilate them on the beach. Yet, the foundations of both plans contain fatal structural flaws. The entire German defensive strategy relies on rapid mechanized counterattacks, but their command structure is a paralyzed, bureaucratic nightmare. The crucial panzer divisions are split, held back deep inland, and bound by Adolf Hitler's explicit orders that they cannot be moved without his personal authorization. At the exact same moment, the meticulously timed American technological assault, reliant on floating tanks and precision bombing, is about to be violently unraveled by the chaotic reality of the English Channel and heavy cloud cover, stripping the infantry of their promised armor and artillery before they even see the sand. At exactly 6:30, the intricate American timetable disintegrates upon contact with reality. Heavy cloud cover over the Normandy coast forces the B-24 bombers to delay their release by crucial seconds, fearful of hitting their own landing craft. Thousands of tons of high explosives fall harmlessly into the French countryside, leaving the concrete strongpoints on the bluffs entirely intact. The preliminary naval bombardment, fired from miles offshore through a thick morning haze, proves largely ineffective against the reinforced bunkers. But the most devastating failure occurs in the churning waters of the channel. Launched too far offshore in heavy swells, the specialized amphibious tanks meant to shield the infantry are instantly swamped. Of the 32 swimming tanks assigned to the eastern half of Omaha, 27 plunge straight to the bottom, taking their crews with them. The infantry is suddenly, terrifyingly alone. When the ramps of the landing craft drop, the soldiers of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions step directly into the undisturbed crosshairs of the 352nd Division. The enfilading fire from Widerstandsnest 62 and its neighboring strongpoints unleashes a metallic storm. Men are cut down in the surf, forced to ditch their heavy gear to avoid drowning, and crawl onto the sand, stripped of their radios, mortars, and leadership. Within 30 minutes, the assault is effectively paralyzed. Survivors huddle behind the meager cover of the shingle bank and steel beach obstacles, pinned down by relentless machine gun fire and zeroed-in artillery. Looking down from their concrete perches, the German defenders see a shattered, disorganized mob and assume the invasion has been decisively crushed at the water's edge. The turning point of Omaha Beach does not arrive via a brilliant strategic directive from Allied High Command. The breakthrough is forged in the chaos by the desperate, localized initiative of isolated men who realize that remaining pinned down means certain annihilation. The rigid invasion plan is abandoned. Survival now dictates the tactics. Among the pinned-down troops is Brigadier General Norman Coda, the assistant commander of the 29th Infantry Division. Refusing to take cover, Coda walks upright through the chaotic fire, rallying terrified men with a blunt reality. Staying on the sand is a death sentence, and the only way out is forward. Spurred by this raw leadership, anonymous combat engineers begin the grueling, lethal work of breaking the deadlock. Crawling through the sand under intersecting fields of fire, these specialists drag Bangalore torpedoes, long steel tubes packed with explosives, up to the dense coils of razor wire blocking the exits. Detonating these charges blows the first critical gaps in the German perimeter, creating narrow, perilous corridors through the defenses. Yet, light infantry alone cannot silence the heavy casemates overlooking these gaps. The decisive leverage comes from the sea, born of a reckless bravery that completely defies naval doctrine. Seeing the infantry trapped and being systematically destroyed, the commanders of the Allied destroyer screen realize the assault is on the verge of total collapse. Ships like the USS Frankfurt and USS Karmic deliberately break formation and steam aggressively toward the shoreline. Risking grounding their keels on the sandbars, these destroyers close to point-blank range, sometimes within 1,000 yards of the beach. They turn their 5-inch guns directly onto the cliffs, engaging in a brutal, direct-fire duel with the German pillboxes. This desperate naval intervention fundamentally shifts the tactical geometry of the battlefield. The massive shells shatter concrete and suppress the heavy artillery plunging down from positions like WN-62. The sheer concussive force compels the German gunners to keep their heads down, momentarily fracturing their meticulously coordinated fields of fire. In that brief window, as smoke and pulverized masonry drift across the bluffs, the dynamics on the sand change. Small, highly disorganized bands of American infantry, no longer operating as unified companies but as ad hoc teams of strangers, begin to study the terrain differently. Through the haze, they start to identify the precise blind spots between the German strongpoints, and for the first time since dawn, they see a faint, brutal opportunity to move inland. The localized suppression provided by the Allied destroyers does not trigger a dramatic, movie-like charge up the bluffs. Instead, it facilitates a slow, excruciatingly methodical infiltration. On the sand, the chaotic mix of survivors from dozens of different landing craft, men from the 16th Infantry Regiment, the 116th, and elite Ranger battalions begin to coalesce, driven by the realization that their only cover is the smoky haze rising from the fires ignited by naval shells and burning U.S. equipment. These small, disorganized bands, often led by junior officers or NCOs who have assumed command by default, abandon all pre-invasion tactical doctrine. They stop moving as massive, synchronized companies and begin to exploit the geography Field Marshal Rommel considered impassable. They ignore the 5 primary draws, which are still heavily defended bottlenecks, and begin to focus on the jagged bluffs between the German resistance nests. It is a meter-by-meter lethal crawl, fueled by desperation and a raw assessment of the terrain as it actually exists, not as it appeared on the missed aerial bombing charts. Looking out from the embrasures of Widerstandsnest 62, the view from the German side is shifting from confident execution to a cold, creeping anxiety. By mid-morning, the ammunition magazines, once stacked high with belted 7.92mm rounds for the MG-42s and heavier shells for the field guns, are visibly dwindling. Soldiers stationed within the complex later recalled the suffocating atmosphere. The air is thick with the toxic fumes of cordite and engine exhaust. The noise from the Allied destroyers' continuous pounding is deafening, and the heat from rapid fire is causing the concrete casemates to sweat. More critically, the technology of the defense itself is reaching its structural limit. The barrels of the rapid-firing MG-42s, subjected to hours of continuous use to suppress the beach, are severely overheating. Despite the use of quick-change barrel gloves and rotation procedures, the rate of fire is dropping simply because the physics of thermal-dynamic stress are melting the steel. German gunners are forced to fire in shorter, less effective bursts to preserve their weapons, a technical limitation that directly impacts their ability to maintain the density of the kill zones on the sand. As the technical suppression from the sea is reinforced by the increasing numbers of U.S. infantry exploiting dead spaces, the German interlocking fire system completely breaks down. The tactical concept of Rommel's Atlantic Wall was never meant to rely on fortified, impenetrable concrete, but rather on the seamless coordination of overlapping fire from independent strongpoints, reinforced by a unified mobile reserve. By 9:30, that coordination is failing. Naval shells have systematically severed the deeply buried landlines connecting WN-62 to General Kreis's division headquarters, and localized interference renders their antiquated radio sets effectively useless. This creates critical operational blind spots. General Kreis is misinterpreting the frantic, fragmented reports from observers, initially believing the beach has held, and that the survivors huddled by the shingle bank represent a beaten, retreating enemy, not the tip of an infiltrating spear. As a consequence, he is either delaying the release of his primary mobile reserve, the 352nd's battle-hardened reconnaissance battalion, or committing smaller reserve platoons to reinforce the draws, missing the critical threat rapidly developing on the sheer slopes away from the paved roads. This breakdown in communication isolates the individual concrete boxes. Neighbors can no longer see or support each other through the thick smoke drifting across the cliffs. U.S. destroyers, shifting targets, are now systematically bombarding known command posts and communication trenches, further fracturing the cohesive German structure. Without radio contact, observers within WN-62 cannot call in coordinates for neighboring artillery batteries to suppress specific American infiltrators, and armored reinforcements are simply not appearing on the bluffs to launch the counterattacks that were fundamental to the Rommel doctrine. Within the strongpoints, defenders realize they are fighting a private, terminal war against an unseen and decentralized enemy. Confidence erodes rapidly as they find themselves unable to track the enemy infantry, which are no longer concentrated in easy target zones, but are moving across dead ground, seemingly indifferent to the fading rate of fire from the primary strongpoints. The psychological impact of this infiltration is palpable inside the German strongpoints. The defenders, who had been systematically destroying a paralyzed assault force since dawn, are now realizing they have been flanked. Observers within WN-62 begin to spot silhouettes of U.S. soldiers, their gear dripping wet, moving not on the beach, but on the very crest of the bluffs, positioned between their own complex and neighboring WN-61. For the German gunners, this is a moment of visceral, tactical horror. The impenetrable fortress they were defending was designed to fire parallel to the beach. It is functionally useless against an enemy attacking from the rear. This shifts the internal dynamic from professional execution to sheer survival instinct. Defenders like Severlo are forced to abandon their heavy casemate weapons and resort to personal rifles or small machine guns, pointing them backward over the parados of their communication trenches. The soldiers, previously the cold distributors of zeroed-in fire, now find themselves exposed, disorganized, and targeted by point-blank fire from above. This localized shift, from fortified exterminator to cut-off fugitive, defines the core mechanics of the Omaha breakthrough. As the surviving American infantry reversed the geometry of the battlefield, the historical narrative of what happened next began to distort, eventually hardening into a post-war myth. For decades, the popular legend of Omaha Beach emphasized endless, overwhelming American industrial might crashing against almost superhuman German resistance. At the center of this mythology stands Heinrich Severlo. Decades after the war, the young gunner from Widerstandsnest 62 publicly claimed he had fired over 12,000 rounds from his MG42 and his Karabiner 98K rifle, estimating he had personally killed or wounded up to 2,000 American soldiers. He became widely known in popular history as the Beast of Omaha, the single soldier who nearly halted the invasion by himself. But documentary history requires separating personal memory from the cold realities of ballistics and logistics. When scrutinized through the lens of tactical records, Severlo's staggering claim unravels. The MG42 was a devastating weapon, but it was bound by the rigid laws of physics. Firing 12,000 rounds in a few hours requires continuous barrel changes to prevent catastrophic melting, inherently creating significant gaps in fire. Furthermore, aiming through thick cordite smoke, the haze of naval bombardments, and extreme combat fatigue reduces actual hit rates to a fraction of a percent. The most definitive evidence, however, is the grim mathematics of the official casualty reports. Total American fatalities across the entire 4-mile expanse of Omaha Beach that day numbered roughly 2,000. It is historically and mathematically impossible for one gunner in a single sector to have inflicted the entirety of the fatal casualties suffered by the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions. The persistence of this myth is telling. It is psychologically easier to attribute the collapse of the Atlantic Wall to an unstoppable tidal wave of American bodies than to confront the fatal systemic flaw in the German military architecture. The true collapse of Omaha Beach was not caused merely by American numerical superiority. It was caused by an absolute lack of defensive depth. Field Marshal Rommel's strategy was to stop the invasion at the water's edge precisely because he knew what lay behind the concrete bunkers: virtually nothing. The Atlantic Wall was a brittle, hollow crust. Once those ad hoc teams of American infantry crawled through the wire and scaled the bluffs, the illusion shattered. There was no secondary line of defense waiting a mile inland. There were no deeply entrenched infantry battalions prepared to seal the breaches. The German doctrine relied on mechanized reserves rushing forward to crush any penetrations. But those vital panzer divisions were paralyzed far inland by a fractured command structure and Adolf Hitler's strict control over their deployment. Without armor to plug the gaps, the American infiltration teams were free to systematically roll up the defensive network from the rear. By midday, the terrifying reality of this strategic vacuum became brutally apparent to the remaining defenders clinging to the bluffs. The geometric advantage that had made the German position so lethal at dawn now completely inverts. For hours, the defenders of Widerstandsnest 62 had poured fire downward, focusing their optics entirely on the killing zones of the beach. By early afternoon, however, the unmistakable sharp crack of M1 Garand rifles and the rapid stutter of Thompson submachine guns begin echoing from the high ground directly behind them. The hunters have become the hunted, trapped inside the very architecture designed to protect them. Inside the command post, the atmosphere is suffocating. The reinforced concrete walls that shielded the garrison from naval artillery now effectively form a tomb. Lieutenant Bernhard Frerking, the artillery observer commanding the sector, realizes the strongpoint is totally isolated. His field telephones are dead, the radios emit only static, and the mechanized reserves promised by the Rommel Doctrine are nowhere to be seen. Instead, small, heavily armed teams of American infantrymen are systematically moving through the tall grass and defilades to their rear. This is not the overwhelming mechanized onslaught the German High Command had wargamed. There are no Sherman tanks crushing the perimeter wire, no massive infantry battalions maneuvering in strict formation. It is a brutal, methodical dismantling by disparate squads of men who survived the morning slaughter and simply kept moving. These ad hoc assault teams leapfrog from crater to crater, using the structural blind spots of the German casemates against them. They employ standard, ruthless infantry tactics, flanking maneuvers, suppressing fire, and the precise application of fragmentation grenades tossed down into the open communication trenches. The heavy German machine guns and anti-tank cannons, anchored in their embrasures and pointed out toward the English Channel, cannot be rotated to defend the rear. The static defense system has been completely outmaneuvered. For Heinrich Sevelow and the surviving garrison, the fortress rapidly devolves into a death trap. Their ammunition reserves, already critically low from the morning's intense suppression fire, are virtually exhausted. Panic begins to replace the disciplined execution of the early hours. Soldiers who had confidently swept the sand with interlocking fire are now crouched in shallow Tobruk pits, frantically firing standard-issue rifles at silhouettes moving through the smoke behind them. The terrifying reality that the position is indefensible finally forces Frerking's hand. The inevitable order is given to abandon Widerstandsnest 62. The men must leave the heavy cover of their concrete bunkers, climb out of the trench network, and attempt to break out inland toward the village of Colville-sur-Mer. It is a desperate, chaotic withdrawal under heavy, close-quarters American fire. Frerking himself is cut down in the retreat, killed as he tries to cross the open ground. Severlow, exhausted and out of options, manages to slip away into the agricultural hedgerows, only to be captured later. Miles away, as fragmented reports finally reach Generalleutnant Dietrich Kreis, a profound shock ripples through the German command structure. The Atlantic Wall at Omaha Beach has not been shattered by a tidal wave of Allied armor or a flawlessly executed master plan from London. It has been unpicked from within. The massive engineered fortress system was quietly and violently dismantled by isolated, desperate men armed with nothing more than rifles, wire cutters, and the raw initiative to climb a hill. The impregnable barrier is broken. Returning to that dawn perspective from Widerstandsnest 62, the contrast is absolute. At 6:30 in the morning, the view from the concrete embrasures was one of unquestioned supremacy. The German gunners had looked down upon a paralyzed, disjointed assault force and reasonably concluded that the invasion was bleeding to death in the surf. By late afternoon, that perspective has been completely erased. The once lethal casemates sit empty, the heavy guns are silent, and a steady stream of American reinforcements is pouring through the Colville draw, moving freely past the abandoned communication trenches. The illusion of an invincible, self-sustaining fortress is permanently shattered. The collapse of this specific sector forces a fundamental re-evaluation of how the Atlantic Wall was actually broken. The victory on the bloodiest beach of the invasion was not a sterile triumph of overwhelming industrial might, simply washing over outgunned defenders. The meticulously engineered Allied operational blueprint had, in fact, completely failed. The amphibious tanks sank, the aerial bombardment missed its targets entirely, and the rigid timetable disintegrated upon contact with the heavy currents and the hardened veterans of the 352nd Infantry Division. Instead, the breakthrough stands as a testament to granular, localized human initiative overcoming catastrophic operational failures. The wall was cracked by anonymous combat engineers crawling through the shingle with explosives, by junior officers who abandoned the pre-invasion playbook to exploit the jagged terrain, and by destroyer captains who recklessly ignored naval doctrine to duel with concrete pillboxes at point-blank range. They succeeded because their desperate actions exposed the fatal vulnerability of the German defensive doctrine. The fatal flaw of the German defense at Omaha was that it relied entirely on a rigid, static barrier that lacked the one element required to survive a breach: a flexible, immediate, mobile reserve. The German engineers had built an architectural masterpiece of interlocking fire, but the moment American infantry severed the communication lines and flanked the strongpoints, the geometry of the defense collapsed. Without armored units free to counterattack, and with a high command paralyzed by bureaucratic delays, the static fortresses simply became concrete traps for the men ordered to hold them. The Atlantic Wall was undoubtedly a formidable obstacle, demanding a staggering price in blood to overcome. But its entire design was anchored to a deeply flawed assumption. The German High Command believed that if they engineered the perfect geometric kill zone, the sheer mathematics of the crossfire would compel any attacking force to freeze on the sand and accept inevitable defeat. They built an intricate, merciless machine of concrete and steel, perfectly calibrated to destroy a predictable enemy following a rigid operational doctrine. The Atlantic Wall did not fail because it was poorly constructed, nor did it collapse merely under the weight of blind industrial machinery. It fell because the architects of that fortress made one fatal miscalculation about human nature. They assumed the infantrymen trapped in the rising surf would simply surrender to the tactical logic of certain death. Instead, those isolated men chose to step forward and rewrite the math entirely.